Okay, forgive me. Just wanted to make sure I was recording so I didn't have to do what I did last time and do this twice. So here I am sharing my screen again, and I will keep going with the slideshow. Okay, so Tiananmen Square is really famous. If you don't know, in 1989, there was a big turnout of college students, Chinese college students, who came to this square to um, peacefully protest some rights that they felt like they weren't getting, protest not getting them. And the Chinese military basically mowed them down. So it's known as the Tiananmen Massacre. And so being in that square is a really almost ghostly, but the Chinese people are intensely patriotic. And so to be patriotic, you can't talk about these things. And that means that you don't really say, "Oh, this was a terrible thing." You just don't talk about it. So you can see the picture of Mao Zedong in the background. He was the leader of China at that time, and or not at that time, but in the past, and kind of set up some things that happened at that point. And um, you also don't talk about the bad things about Mao Zedong. You say, maybe he wasn't the greatest ruler, but he was a really good man or something like that. If you're speaking to a Chinese person, you usually focus on something good about him, even though he did a lot of terrible things. And the Chinese people know that. It's not that they are stupid. It's just that they are so intensely patriotic. It's very difficult for them to speak about anything negative in Chinese history, which is long and beautiful. There's so much art and culture that comes from China. And it's hard for us as Americans to really even understand because we just don't have this. We don't have such a long history. And when they talk about history, they're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of even years of recorded history. And we just have hundreds and we're just babies. And so when a Chinese person talks about China, they're carrying all of that history along with them. And we really, as Americans, don't have any concept. And even Europeans uh, don't really have a concept of that. So it's good to have an idea of what we're dealing with when we're talking about the Chinese people. Um, and when I lived in Qingdao for the year, Dongjiang it was right next to, it was a little tiny town that the school where I taught was located in, and it was a fishing village. And the boats literally looked like Bible times. And they would, in the evenings, all of the fishermen would come into the town of Dongjiang and they would spread their nets and they would dry their little fish that they caught during the day in the courtyards. And if you walked through the town, it smelled like fish, and you'd have to not, you'd have to be careful and not walk on there drying fish. And it was beautiful. And I definitely have a lot of love. So that is the sun setting over Dongjiang, out over the sea. And this is my team that I went to China with for the year. Sorry about the red eyes. Before digital photos, a lot of photos had red eyes. This is the school where I taught. It was a boarding school for even elementary. So it was elementary and middle schoolers. And we had boarders who were as young as 2. Um, and so there really weren't supposed to be 2-year-olds in the kindergarten, but one of the teachers had a child who was 2, and so that child was the only 2-year-old boarder. Most of them were at least 4. This was my 3rd grade class, and I only taught them English, of course, not their other subjects. So these were their other teachers. And we went on a field trip into Qingdao one day, and they were just acting like normal kids. And all these kids are all grown up now. If I still were in contact with them, they'd be adults with their own kids. Um, and during our winter break in 2001, we were able to go to Thailand, and our team took a trek into northern Thailand. We were able to ride on an elephant and go down a river on a little raft and see opium fields and all kinds of really awesome stuff. And here's just a little walk around Dongjiang. And we were definitely foreigners, which they call Dabeiza, which means big nose, or Huang Fa, which means yellow hair. So whenever we walked around Dongjiang, they would definitely follow us and make fun of us lightly. So I'm going to post this video on the classwork webpage. You can go back and watch this. This is a little bit about the persecution that Christians face currently in China. And so this is from 2020. It's the latest stuff that I could find. And I showed this last year in my middle school class when we read Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, just to give them an idea of Chinese culture and how they deal with religion. And there is an allowed church in China. It's called the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. It's not as bad as it sounds. It comes from something that happened a long time ago with missionaries. It's perfectly fine, but every pastor in the Three Self Movement Church has to submit their sermons to the government to be okayed. Every person who attends one of those churches has to be on a government list so that if they ever do decide to persecute, they know exactly who they are. So the Chinese people have created house churches, which is their underground church, and they will, like maybe 12 families will be a part of this house church, and on a random time, like a Saturday afternoon, they would try to kind of trickle into an apartment, and then they would maybe even whisper their hymns and have a meal together and talk about Jesus. And this is totally illegal. So this video shows some of those house churches being broken up and what's going on now for those. It is still going on. There's still Christians being put in jail just because they're Christians in China. So you have some notes on the homework pages, the Chinese stories homework pages that I just wanted to fill out that one note page. First of all, the introduction to those Chinese stories is completely prejudiced. I very much dislike it. This guy is obviously not it's old, and he does not understand the Chinese people. He can speak their language, he's studied their literature, he's studied their culture a little bit, but he does not understand them. But some of the things that he says are true in the introduction, and he did a good job translating the stories. So that's why we're reading his book. One of the things he says, which really cuts close to the heart of the Chinese people, is that everything which belongs to them forms part of the center of the universe, and all that is beyond their immediate cognizance, meaning their immediate knowledge, is foreign and negligible. So the character for China, Zhongguo, is middle kingdom. And you can see that the word middle is a rectangle with a slash down the middle of it. And when you are writing characters, you do it in a certain way. Like you would definitely do the left-hand mark first, and then make the rectangle around that, and then make a slash. That would be zhong. And then the same kind of thing for the second rectangle, except don't finish it. So you would do the left-hand side and then top and right-hand side. And then pretty sure it's the 3 marks that are horizontal first, and then the parallel mark, and then the small mark, and then you finish the rectangle for guo, which is the word for country. The Chinese people consider themselves as the middle country. If you look at a map that is made in America, you're going to have America over on the left side, the US over on the left side, and Europe and China over on the right. We call them the Far East. Well, they don't consider themselves far east. They consider themselves right in the middle. So they would be right here in the middle of the map. And that's their name, and that's where they see themselves. So it's not necessarily wrong. We see ourselves the same way. And so that's where the writer of this book really just went off into left field. Like, we're just so tolerant, but the Chinese people are not. It's just not true. We think our ways are the best. They think their ways are the best. Doesn't everyone? So here's the rest of these notes. Chinese have a word for humor that they also use for fiction, xiaohua. This seems to indicate that they do not hold fiction as very important, but even the most educated Chinese scholar occasionally indulges in the fictitious adventures of heroes and heroines. The earliest stories that we know of in China are those enshrined in the Book of Odes, the contents of which date back to the time of Solomon. Their themes are for the most part idyllic scenes of country life in which love, tempered with subdued passion, plays a prominent part. So you're not going to see a whole lot of yelling and screaming and like extreme climaxes in these stories. They're going to be very ideal and calm, and you know, there's some humor and lightness in it, but it's very different from American stories or from Western stories. So, and unless these stories are misrepresentation, Chinese wives, downtrodden as they are in theory, and they really are, there were many things that Chinese wives in history could not do. But they managed to assert themselves in the most unmistakable manner. Henpecked husbands are the common butts of these storytellers. So you're going to see some henpecked husbands and some very assertive wives, which makes for very comic situations in these stories. Now, let me circle back to the xiaohua. So Chinese characters are pictograms, and they sometimes represent things like the character for middle. And sometimes they don't really have any, any connection to the thought that they represent. They just are more like letters. So there are lots and lots of characters. The common person can't read through an entire newspaper without coming upon characters that they don't know. I think the common Chinese person knows like 550, but there are like 3,000 or something like that. So what Westerners have always done when they visited China was to try to make these representations of the characters in our letters. So HSIAO says Xiao. Well, back when this guy was writing, Xiao was written TSIAO or TSAO or something like that. So it's not always been written the same way. Same character, Xiao, but written two different ways. Well, we call the common way to write these down right now pinyin, PINYIN, pinyin. And it's just a way for us to be able to read Chinese without having to read characters. So I studied characters a lot for the year I was in China, but I never got very far with characters. But I can read a little pinyin and remember some of the words. So I do remember xiao, which is little, and hua, which means talk or speech. So in some ways, Chinese is really simple. There's there's only one pronoun, ta, for he, she, it. There's no tenses for verbs and things like that, but you also have these the four tones that you use for Chinese. So this word zhong is middle, zhong, but if you said zhong, it would be a totally different word because the tone is different. So that's the only part that makes it pretty difficult to learn for Americans. All right, so Chinese stories, we're going to cover 4 of them, 3 before spring break and 1 after. The one that is due after is a little bit longer. So that you'll just have 1 story to do for that week. So this is how we're going to do the stories. You're going to list and describe 5 characters. You're going to summarize the plot. You're going to tell me why you enjoyed or why you didn't enjoy the story. You're going to find some words that you find interesting or that you need to define. And then you don't have to fill out this 6 through 10. That'll be words from other classmates. And then tell me how the story is uniquely Chinese. And this is all, well, the characters are fact, but a lot of this is your opinion. So this is not a right or wrong thing. This is just you interacting with the story and really connecting with it. You're also going to write your own story. You can go back and study these things later on. I'm just going to skim through this. And on March 8th, which is next week, I want you to have these questions answered about this short story that you're going to write. If you have any questions about that, you're welcome to email me. So I hope you guys have fun at your band event. And those others of you who are missing class, I hope this helps for you to be able to make it up. And I will see you guys when you get back.